It may not be a particularly pretty sight nowadays, but Medal of Honor Allied Assault's D-Day mission is one of the most influential video game levels ever created, and honestly, it doesn't get anywhere near the recognition it deserves. So I'm going to attempt to help remedy that by looking at the mission to try and better explain why it's such an important part of video game history, and also have a gander at a few other first-person D-Days featured in games since, to see if anything's actually changed all that much. As we approach the beach at the beginning of Allied Assault's D-Day mission, known as Operation Overlord in-game, allow me to super duper quickly explain why this level is so special. This level is so special because it is the proof of concept for the Call of Duty series and every other first-person shooter in its action-packed, set-piece-driven, war-focused subgenre. Allied Assault was the first of its kind, and the games which came after owe their success, at least to some degree, to the Medal of Honor series. Playing this mission back in 2001, it became very clear to me straight away that Allied Assault's D-Day mission was something incredible. It might not look like much now, but as the doors to the boat opened and soldiers fell to machine gun fire, it was difficult not to be completely immersed by the scene in front of you. Shooters at the time had gone through something of a renaissance in the way they delivered action and exposition thanks to Half-Life's incredible set pieces, and Allied Assault took what Valve pioneered and for the first time ever applied it to a very different type of first-person shooter. Where Half-Life used set pieces to support the rest of its experience, during Operation Overlord and much of the rest of Allied Assault, the set pieces very much became the experience. Half-Life set pieces were used somewhat sparingly after its opening to help break up levels or provide climactic moments, but Allied Assault used them to create something far more cinematic, something far more directed. Every which way you looked there was something going on, and it felt like a much more curated experience than anything else available at the time. Given the market saturation in the present thanks to Call of Duty's relentless success, that might sound like a negative. Heavily stage-managed campaigns often ultimately present players with less choice, and heaven knows there's been so many games featuring them released over the last 10 to 15 years that they feel a little like they've been done to death. But in 2001, this approach was genuinely revolutionary. The production values of Saving Private Ryan's D-Day scenes had amazed cinema goers a few years prior, and Allied Assault and Operation Overlord provided the proof that video games could take their cues from cinema to evoke similar reactions in their audiences. And it helped, of course, that Allied Assault's D-Day Spectacular was also essentially the video game version of Saving Private Ryan's most harrowing scene. To put it simply, in terms of presentation, Allied Assault was a game completely unlike anything else you could play at the time in the genre. This new style of set-piece driven, heavily scripted, cinematic first-person design in my view had a huge knock-on effect in terms of gameplay as well. What Operation Overlord also proved is that the simplest gameplay concepts could be given a whole new lease of life, or be made to feel like something entirely new even if they weren't, through the use of careful direction and set pieces. Let's take the first few moments on the beach as an example. Given how much there was to take in, I guess the fact its gameplay essentially mimics 1981 arcade classic Frogger probably passed quite a few people by, and I'll tell you now, the gameplay is very similar to 1981 arcade classic Frogger. In Frogger, you had to time crossing roads perfectly to move between safe areas, and Allied Assault essentially tasks you with doing the same thing on the beach, except instead of moving between pavements, you're moving between cover, and instead of timing your movement to avoid cars, you're timing your movement to avoid a barrage of gunfire. In terms of gameplay, what's featured here is by no means a new concept, but the presentation around it somewhat masks that, or perhaps even conceals it entirely. You're not thinking about how you're essentially still just a frog on a street, because you're completely immersed in the experience at hand. Bullets whizzing past you, allies getting blown up around you, trying to desperately figure out how you'll survive just a few moments longer. It's a similar situation when you fight your way through the bunker at the end of the mission. You're not thinking about how this section is in gameplay terms essentially a slightly more modern Wolfenstein 3D. You're thinking about the guard appearing at the top of the ladder you're climbing, the one who kicks over a table, or the pair having a nice chat unaware of your presence. Some of you watching this might think I'm maybe being a little bit reductive. Surely you could do this to just about any game if you boiled things down enough. What I'd say to that is that you need to look at the games that were releasing around the same time to understand why Allied Assault's relative simplicity in terms of gameplay is so important to take into account. As I mentioned earlier, Half-Life used set pieces to help raise the bar for how a shooter could be presented, but with fantastic AI and cohesive level design, it also helped push the genre's gameplay forward too. Halo Combat Evolved again set a new bar for presentation, this time on console, but also featured its own raft of gameplay improvements, including more responsive controls, the two-weapon system, and the recharging health mechanic. Honestly, when you look at Allied Assault, there's plenty of innovation in terms of how it presents its action, but its gameplay didn't do anything new at all, and that's why I think the comparisons to older games in Allied Assault's case are necessary. You could put Half-Life and Halo Combat Evolved's presentation to one side, and they would still be considered incredibly innovative titles. Take away the spectacle from Medal of Honor's D-Day, and there's not really much new on offer, which is why I think the game is talked about a lot less these days as one which had a huge influence on shooters, compared to, say, the other two titles I just mentioned. However, I don't want to end this portion of the video on a glum note, so I want to take a moment to reiterate what I said earlier. Allied Assault was the game which proved that heavily directing players' experiences during a first-person shooter, similar to how a director chooses precisely what's on screen in a film, could serve to elevate the impact gameplay had by making simple concepts feel far more intense than they ever had before, and nowhere is this more prevalent than in the mission Operation Overlord. It was the mission which proved that set-piece-driven, cinematic first-person shooters were a viable subgenre all of their own. Call of Duty may be the series which went on to be the most well-known example of this style of FPS, but Allied Assault and Operation Overlord must always be acknowledged as the ones who created it to begin with. Moving on, we'll come back to Call of Duty again very shortly, but I do first want to quickly acknowledge Medal of Honor Frontline, which released on the PlayStation 2 just a few months after Allied Assault hit store shelves. It also features a D-Day sequence, this time at its very start compared to 3 missions into Allied Assault, and while it missed becoming the title I'd call revolutionary by a few months, I think it's worth acknowledging as it did throw in a slight twist of its own. That twist being the scene at the very start of the level, which takes control away from you while you're in the water, copied almost entirely from Saving Private Ryan. It's not the framing of this scene, however, that I want to highlight, but rather the idea of taking away control from players. At no point in Allied Assault's Operation Overlord did that happen, and it's something that slowly crept into the subgenre more and more as it's continued to hone its techniques, or simplified them depending on how you look at it. Other than that, Frontline's D-Day is extremely similar to Allied Assault's in terms of how it plays out. You storm the beach, which it should be noted is far easier to actually do in Frontline. You help with the Bangalores to blow a hole in your next objective, and you do a little trench fighting, although this part is much more fleshed out in Allied Assault. Visually, it's of course a less impressive affair than its PC counterpart, which is to be expected, and there's far fewer soldiers storming the beach, which detracts from the scale a little, but overall it's a very, very impressive demonstration of how this new breed of shooter worked just as well on consoles at the time as it did on PC. Just 18 months after Allied Assault, the first Call of Duty launched, but it wasn't until 2005 and Call of Duty 2 that Infinity Ward decided to create their own D-Day mission. A quick note on Infinity Ward. The company was founded in 2002 by Grant Collier, Jason West and Vince Zampella, and consisted primarily of members of 2015 Games, the studio which developed Allied Assault. After issues with EA during their time at 2015 Games, developing Call of Duty for Activision I'd imagine was in part something of a screw you to EA, and I don't find it overly surprising that Infinity Ward waited until technology had advanced far enough before attempting to take on Medal of Honor's pièce de résistance. Zampella and West's studios, namely 2015 Games, Infinity Ward and later Respawn Entertainment, are after all responsible for pretty much all of the defining titles in the subgenre, from their work on Allied Assault to Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare to Titanfall 2. But to be totally honest, while Infinity Ward's attempt is very entertaining, it also, I think, only serves to further prove the point I made earlier about Allied Assault's gameplay. It hits the same beats again and evokes a similar atmosphere, but builds very little on what was featured in Medal of Honor beyond vastly improved graphics and a far greater sense of scale. And much like Frontline, it even again features a moment where control is taken away from you on the beach in order for another scene very reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan to play out. Even during this early period in the subgenre's life, just 4 years after Allied Assault and Operation Overlord, you can see that developers had already begun to focus on upping the spectacle without considering how gameplay should evolve to complement it. Which brings us nicely on to Call of Duty World War II, by far the most modern of any of the games I've talked about so far. Having played its D-Day mission for the first time recently while working on this video, I have to say, visually it is an absolutely spectacular experience. Playing on a PC with all the bells and whistles turned on, it really was a sight to behold. However, like Call of Duty 2 before it, that's about all there is of note here. Yes, it's more violent, more intense and more spectacular than any D-Day mission preceding it, but looking at Allied Assault and then back to Call of Duty World War II, I honestly see little in the way of gameplay evolution. There are more scenes which take control away from you and some half-baked mechanics like the partner system, but that's really about it. The gameplay loop itself isn't a whole lot more complex than it was in Allied Assault to begin with, and it certainly doesn't feel like 16 years worth of progress in terms of gameplay. There's also this set piece at the end, which is equal parts exhilarating and completely and utterly stupid. You drag your wounded friend across the battlefield while stopping every so often to shoot approaching enemies, and it all just gets a little bit ridiculous. If Call of Duty 2 painted a clear picture of where the subgenre was headed, towards spectacle and away from gameplay innovation, then Call of Duty 2 stands as a monument to that journey. It is visually extraordinary, but shallow in terms of gameplay, a phrase I think you could use to describe any of the 4 games I've spoken about during this video. These examples of increasing levels of spectacle over the years, combined with a lack of true innovation in the subgenre, really only serve to prove one thing: that Allied Assault's Operation Overlord is an extraordinarily influential mission. In most other genres, or indeed subgenres, gameplay, graphics, and many other parts of them have continued to evolve and mutate over time, to the point where older titles feel a little rough to go back and play in the present. But when it comes to Allied Assault's Operation Overlord, I genuinely believe you could give it just a graphical overhaul and not change much else, and it wouldn't seem that far behind much more modern recreations of the same scenario. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that looking at the different representations of D-Day, it's the title which demonstrates most realistically how unlikely it would be that you'd actually survive the experience. None of this is necessarily a slight on the other games featured in this video, nor on any Call of Duty title or the many other games which have attempted similar. It's simply an indication of what an incredibly immersive and groundbreaking experience Allied Assault's Operation Overlord mission actually was for its time. Cheers for taking the time to watch the video, boys and girls. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, commenting, and maybe even subscribing if you feel extra generous, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.